On August 19th, Nolan Wells would have turned 19 years old. Instead, that date now sits at the center of two very different things happening at once: a national day of prayer his family has organized in his memory, and the final day of a 7-day deadline his family's advocates have given the FBI to respond to a formal demand for a federal investigation into his death. One of those two things is about grief. The other is about power. Both are happening on the same day to the same family, and understanding the difference between them is the whole point of this episode, and honestly the whole point of most of what we try to do on this channel with a case this saturated in both real developments and manufactured ones. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we're breaking down a full press conference held during the National Association of Black Journalists' annual convention in Atlanta, featuring Reverend Al Sharpton, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, Attorney Ben Crump, additional attorneys representing the Wells family, and Nolan's parents, Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley, speaking at length for the first time in several weeks. There's a lot in this press conference. Some of it is genuinely new, verifiable information about where this case's legal and political tracks actually stand. Some of it is advocacy, delivered by people whose entire professional purpose is to apply public pressure on behalf of a grieving family, which is a legitimate thing for them to do, but which we think deserves to be clearly labeled as advocacy rather than presented as an established fact about the underlying investigation. We're going to try to keep those two categories separate throughout, the same discipline we've tried to apply to every source in this case, whether it's a defense attorney, a civil rights advocate, or an anonymous audio engineer somewhere in the background of all of it. Quick anchor for anyone joining us for the first time. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a first-year wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, when he disappeared from Horn Island, Mississippi on July 4th and was found dead in the water 2 days later. His friends say he chose to stay behind on the island rather than return with them. His parents have publicly disputed that account in detail, pointing to the fact that he didn't have his phone with him, and that the explanation for why he stayed has shifted slightly across different retellings over the following weeks. The state's official autopsy findings remain sealed pending presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. An independent autopsy commissioned by the family, performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr., a board-certified forensic pathologist and president of the National Medical Association, listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. No charges have been filed in connection with his death, though multiple individuals have been separately charged in different states for making threats against witnesses, officials, and family members connected to this case, including a Chancery Court judge whose own son was aboard the boat that departed the island without Nolan that afternoon. Let's start with the most concrete, verifiable development to come out of this press conference: the formal demand for federal involvement and the specific timeline attached to it. Congresswoman Lucy McBath, speaking as second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, confirmed that the caucus has sent a formal written letter demanding a full federal investigation into Nolan's death, addressed to FBI Director Kash Patel. When a reporter asked directly whether that letter had been delivered and what deadline had been given for a response, McBath initially said no specific deadline had been set. Then, moments later, in response to a follow-up question, clarified that the family's legal team had in fact given federal authorities 7 days to respond. That's a real, specific, checkable claim. A formal congressional letter sent to a named federal official with an explicit 7-day response window attached to it. Whether the FBI actually responds within that window, and what that response looks like if it comes, is something we can track and verify as it happens. Unlike a great deal of what circulates around this case, most of which arrives without any comparable deadline, any comparable named recipient, or any comparable way to hold anyone accountable for following through on it. It's worth understanding why McBath, specifically, carries the weight she does in this conversation. Beyond her formal role in Congress and the institutional authority the caucus vice chair title itself confers on whatever she chooses to put her name behind. She's spoken publicly, including at this press conference, about losing her own son, Jordan Davis, to gun violence in 2012, a case that also became a national flashpoint around race and self-defense law in Florida. Ben Crump represented her family in that case as well, which is how the two of them met and eventually built the working relationship that's brought them to this podium together again, more than a decade later, representing a different grieving mother and father. That history doesn't make her statements about this case more factually accurate on their own, and we want to be careful not to imply that shared personal tragedy automatically confers investigative expertise about a different case entirely. It does explain why she's chosen to lend her specific congressional authority and the CBC's institutional weight to pushing this particular case toward federal review rather than treating it as a purely local Mississippi matter best left entirely to state and county officials. It's worth explaining, in a little more detail, what a formal Congressional Black Caucus letter to an FBI director actually does and doesn't accomplish on its own, because the political mechanics here matter for calibrating expectations rather than assuming either that nothing will happen or that federal intervention is now essentially guaranteed. A letter from a caucus of sitting members of Congress carries real institutional weight and typically guarantees some form of response, if only because ignoring formal congressional correspondence entirely tends to generate its own separate controversy. It does not, on its own, compel the FBI to open an investigation. The Bureau retains discretion over which cases meet its jurisdictional and evidentiary thresholds for federal involvement, and a request from Congress, however forcefully worded, is a request, not a directive with the force of law behind it. An important distinction that got somewhat lost in how enthusiastically this deadline has been reported elsewhere as though it were binding. McBath and Sharpton both seemed aware of this distinction in their own remarks, framing the letter as the first step in a longer campaign of political pressure, including a reference to a potential change in control of the House after the November midterms as a further point of leverage if the FBI declines to act now, a two-step strategy that assumes this specific week's deadline is a beginning rather than a final word either way. That's a realistic assessment of how this kind of political pressure campaign typically works, not an overstatement of what a single letter, by itself, guarantees. And it's worth remembering that realistic framing, the next time a headline implies the FBI is now legally required to act within exactly 7 days of this specific press conference. Sharpton's own remarks at this press conference lean considerably further into political territory. And we want to flag that distinction clearly rather than let it blend into the more factual material around it. He described the current presidential administration in Washington as one the family cannot feel will objectively investigate their son's death, and framed the upcoming November midterm elections, specifically the possibility of a change in control of the House of Representatives, as the family's realistic path toward oversight if federal authorities decline to act now. That's Sharpton's political assessment and strategic framing, not a neutral fact about the investigation itself, and reasonable people, including people who agree entirely that Nolan's family deserves transparency, can disagree about that specific political framing. We think it's important to let you hear it stated plainly, in his own words, rather than either laundering it into neutral-sounding narration or leaving it out entirely because it's uncomfortable. We should also mention, for context rather than comparison, that Sharpton opened the press conference by noting he was traveling the following day to deliver a eulogy in Madison, Wisconsin, for a separate case involving a homeless black man shot and killed by police officers, a case he described as raising similarly serious questions. He wasn't drawing a direct evidentiary link between that case and Nolan Wells' death. He was situating this specific press conference inside a broader pattern of cases his organization has taken on, which is useful background for understanding his own framing of Nolan's case as part of a larger, ongoing body of work rather than an isolated event. There's a specific legal and jurisdictional question raised during the question and answer portion of this press conference that we think is worth taking seriously on its own technical merits, separate from the political framing around it. A reporter, identifying himself as Jesse Jackson Jr., with a radio show called KLA Today, asked whether any death investigation had been opened by the National Park Service specifically, since Horn Island, where Nolan's body was found, is federal property, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore administered by the Park Service. We want to be clear that we have not independently confirmed whether this questioner is the same Jesse Jackson Jr., previously known for his time in Congress, and we're not asserting that he is. Multiple people share that name, and we don't have enough information from this recording alone to confirm his identity, one way or the other. Setting the questioner's identity aside, his underlying question is a legitimate one. Horn Island's status as federal land, managed by the National Park Service, is a matter of public record. Whether that status creates any independent federal investigative jurisdiction, separate from the FBI involvement Nolan's family is separately requesting, is a genuine legal question, and it's one the press conference didn't fully answer. The reporter went on to draw a comparison to 7 arrests made in connection with people wading into the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial, also federal Park Service property, asking why that specific enforcement disparity exists in this case. That comparison is a rhetorical device, not a legal argument with the same elements on both sides. Since wading into a reflecting pool and a death investigation involve entirely different statutory frameworks, different agencies' jurisdiction, and different evidentiary thresholds, we think the underlying question about the National Park Service's role is worth someone with actual expertise in federal land jurisdiction answering directly. We don't think the reflecting pool comparison on its own tells us anything meaningful about whether Horn Island's federal status should have triggered a different investigative response here. It's worth noting, for anyone curious about the mechanics here rather than the rhetoric, that National Park Service law enforcement rangers do have jurisdiction to investigate crimes occurring on Park Service land and routinely coordinate with the FBI on serious cases, including deaths that occur within park boundaries. Whether that coordination has actually happened in Nolan's case, at what level, and with what outcome, is not something this press conference clarified, and it's not something we've been able to independently confirm through any other source as of this recording. It remains, as far as we can tell, a genuinely open question, rather than a settled one in either direction, and we'd rather say that plainly than guess. Now to something considerably more human and considerably less contested, the prayer vigil planned for August 19th, Nolan's 19th birthday. According to Crump's remarks and separate reporting from the Mississippi Free Press, a vigil led by Reverend Jamal Bryant will be held at 7 that evening at Greater St. John AME Church in Biloxi, Mississippi, with additional vigils planned in other cities around the country, including one on Martha's Vineyard, a reach that speaks to how far this case has traveled well beyond Mississippi's own borders in the 6 weeks since Nolan died. Christine and Elmore both spoke directly and personally about what this specific date means to them, separate from any of the legal or political maneuvering happening around their son's case. Christine described the approaching date as making the reality of his absence sink in a new way, noting that unlike other parents who still get to call their children, hug them, celebrate birthdays with them, that ordinary experience has simply been taken from her family permanently. A loss she described as extending beyond just her own grief to the way her surviving children are processing it alongside her. Elmore described the same tension almost everyone grieving a loss on a specific calendar date describes, knowing the day is going to bring both painful memories and, in his words, some laughter, as they think back on who Nolan was, alongside the unavoidable fact that a very big piece of their family will no longer physically be there for it. Crump added a detail to this same portion of the press conference that we think is worth including precisely because it's so ordinary, and ordinary details tend to get lost in a case this consumed by legal strategy and political pressure campaigns. He described watching Elmore work hard alongside Nolan on his football career, noting this coming season was really going to be his year, the kind of milestone excitement any parent watching a child approach the edge of adulthood might describe. Crump framed July 4th as the date that permanently changed what that particular kind of hope looks like for this specific family, a framing considerably less legally aggressive than most of his other remarks in the same press conference, and one that reads, on the page, as a moment where the advocate briefly set aside the case-building language and simply grieved alongside 2 parents he's clearly come to know personally over the past 6 weeks. We think it's worth sitting with that for a moment before moving back into the more contested, more political material in this press conference, because it's easy for a case this saturated with legal maneuvering, competing forensic claims, and dueling media appearances to lose sight of the fact that at the center of all of it is a specific family approaching a birthday their son should have been alive to see in a house that will have one fewer person at the table than it should. Let's turn to a detail from this press conference that we think has been significantly misunderstood elsewhere in this case's coverage. The cease-and-desist letters Crump addressed directly during the question and answer session a topic that's generated its own small wave of confused summaries online in the days since this press conference happened. When a reporter asked about misinformation spreading on social media, Crump read from a prepared statement defending, in his words, the First Amendment rights of content creators reporting on Nolan Wells' case, saying the family's legal team stands with content creators, independent journalists, and citizens who are responsibly reporting on the Nolan Wells case and asking legitimate questions in pursuit of truth and accountability, and expressing concern about cease-and-desist letters or legal pressure being used to intimidate or silence lawful scrutiny. Taken in isolation, that statement could easily be read as Crump defending content creators against legal threats coming from the Friends side of this case, or perhaps against the Wells family's own legal team using similar tactics. Neither reading appears to be accurate based on outside reporting. The cease-and-desist letters that have actually generated news coverage in this case came from a completely different direction. From attorney Russell Latino, representing the family of Bart Edmiston, the young man we've covered extensively in a previous episode about the disputed enhanced audio recording. Latino's letters were sent to specific individuals accused of publishing what he called false and defamatory statements, naming Edmiston as a suspect without any publicly available evidence supporting that claim, and, more seriously, of publishing Edmiston's home address, property records, and information about his family members. The Edmiston family has separately said it's working with the FBI and federal prosecutors to determine whether interstate cyberstalking laws were violated by whoever did that. Crump's statement, read in that fuller context, appears to be threading a careful needle, affirming that legitimate questions, opinions, and scrutiny of this case deserve First Amendment protection, while implicitly drawing the same line Latino's letters draw, that publishing someone's home address and accusing them of a crime with zero supporting evidence crosses into a different category entirely. We think that's a defensible, coherent position for Crump to hold. We don't think it's accurately described based on what's actually in this transcript, as Crump defending content creators against a threat coming from his own side of the case or from the Friends side. The actual dispute he's addressing appears to involve neither of those parties directly. It's worth going a bit deeper into what actually happened to Bart Edmiston, since we've covered his situation before, and this press conference adds a new layer to it. According to WLOX's own reporting, the Edmiston family said one specific content creator had been identified as the origin point of multiple accusations against him, and was served with both a cease-and-desist letter and a spoliation letter, a legal document specifically instructing someone to preserve rather than delete any evidence relevant to a potential future lawsuit. The family also said this same creator had published photographs of their home, their residential address, land plats identifying their property, and information about family members' employment, details that go considerably beyond simply voicing an opinion or asking a question about the case, and that start to resemble the kind of targeted harassment campaign no amount of First Amendment protection was ever designed to shield. The Edmiston family has said they're working directly with the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and local law enforcement to determine whether federal and state cyberstalking statutes were violated, a step that signals how seriously they're treating the harm already done, regardless of what happens with the underlying speculation about Nolan's death itself. An FBI spokesperson for the Bureau's Jackson field office told WLOX the agency has been separately working to address interstate threats received by individuals connected to this case, running in parallel with, but distinct from, Jackson County's own investigation into Nolan's death itself, two tracks that are easy to accidentally blend together in casual conversation about the case, but that involve entirely different alleged crimes, different potential defendants, and different timelines. That's a genuinely important distinction. There is now more than one active federal thread connected to this case, one potentially examining Nolan's death directly, and a separate one already actively investigating threats and harassment against people caught up in the speculation surrounding it, including, apparently, at least one person with no established connection to what actually happened on Horn Island, a fact worth remembering the next time a channel or commenter conflates every federal mention in this case into a single storyline. There's another specific, verifiable update buried in this press conference that we think matters more than most of the political rhetoric surrounding it: the current status of Nolan's phone. Attorney Lisa Park, part of the family's legal team, described an agreement reached at a July 15th meeting with the Jackson County District Attorney's Office, under which the DA's office, the family's own forensic team, and potentially the FBI would jointly download and examine the phone's contents in a single session, rather than multiple parties handling the device separately at different times, a distinction that turns out to matter quite a bit once you understand the forensic reasoning behind it. Park compared this directly to standard evidence handling procedure in a serious car accident investigation, where the vehicle itself isn't repeatedly moved and independently examined by different parties, but processed once together to preserve a single clean chain of custody. As of this press conference, the family's team said they remain ready to proceed and are waiting on the district attorney's office to set a specific date, time, and location for that joint examination. Attorney Eric Hurt, heading the family's independent investigation, added that he was personally available that same day to meet with the FBI and outside forensic experts to move the process forward, an offer he made directly on the record rather than simply describing it after the fact. This is a genuinely useful piece of information for anyone trying to track this case accurately. There is an actual, agreed-upon process for examining Nolan's phone, involving multiple parties working together rather than in isolation, and the current bottleneck, according to the family's own attorneys, is simply the DA's office scheduling it, not any refusal by either side to cooperate. Separately, Attorney Hurt confirmed that Dr. Roger Mitchell, the forensic pathologist who conducted the family's independent autopsy, has made himself available to return and conduct further examination whenever the district attorney's office and the state medical examiner's office allow it. That's a detail worth remembering the next time you see speculation online about whether the family's side has stopped pursuing additional forensic work. According to their own legal team, the offer to do more remains standing. And the limiting factor is institutional access, not willingness. It's worth pausing on why a joint, single-session forensic examination actually matters so much in a case like this one, beyond the car accident analogy Park offered. Every time a piece of digital evidence changes hands, gets copied, or gets examined using different forensic tools by different parties independently, it creates additional points where questions about chain of custody can later be raised, either legitimately or as a deliberate defense strategy. A single, jointly witnessed examination with the district attorney's office, the family's forensic team, and potentially the FBI all present and observing the same extraction process at the same time, produces one clean, mutually verified record that all parties can point back to later, rather than multiple separate accounts that could theoretically diverge or be challenged against each other. This is standard practice in complex, high-profile investigations, specifically because it removes an entire category of downstream dispute before it can start. The fact that the family's team has been requesting exactly this kind of joint process since at least mid-July and says it remains ready to proceed on short notice is a genuinely useful data point for anyone trying to assess how cooperative each side of this case has actually been in practice, separate from how cooperative each side describes itself as being in press conferences and friendly interviews. We want to address two smaller moments from the question and answer session with real care, because we think both of them illustrate exactly the kind of claim that's easy to either overstate or dismiss too quickly, and we'd rather sit in the uncomfortable middle than do either. The first involves a specific verbal detail Elmore Wonsley was asked about directly. A reporter noted that when Elmore visited the home of one of Nolan's friends, referred to in the transcript simply as Jack's, in the period after Nolan went missing but before his body had been found, Jack's reportedly used past tense, describing Nolan as someone who was like a brother, rather than present tense. The reporter asked whether that grammatical shift had, in the moment, registered as any kind of alarm bell. Elmore's answer was direct and, we think, entirely understandable. He said that in that specific moment, his mind and focus were entirely on trying to find his son, not on parsing the tense of a sentence someone said to him. We think it would be irresponsible for us, or for anyone covering this case, to build a theory out of a single verb tense recalled under conditions of acute parental panic, especially when the person who actually heard it in real time has explicitly said he wasn't reading anything into it at the time. People misspeak under stress constantly, in every direction, without it reflecting anything about what they know or don't know. We're including this detail because it was raised on the record and deserves acknowledgement. not because we think it's meaningful evidence of anything. There's a broader pattern in how grief-adjacent language gets treated in cases like this one that we think is worth naming directly, because we've now encountered variations of it across several episodes on this specific case. A close friend saying, "I love you," in what turns out to be a final conversation gets read online as a premonition. A friend using past tense in the chaos of a search for a missing person gets read as a slip revealing hidden knowledge. A mark of unclear origin on a recovered body gets read as confirmed trauma. In each case, the underlying behavior, an affectionate goodbye, an accidental verb tense, an ambiguous forensic finding, has a far more mundane explanation readily available, and in each case, the more dramatic reading requires assuming the person involved was either lying or unconsciously revealing guilt, rather than simply behaving the way any person under extreme stress ordinarily behaves. We don't think grief and panic make people speak with the careful precision true crime audiences sometimes expect of them after the fact. We think expecting that precision and then treating its absence as evidence tells you more about the expectations of true crime coverage as a genre than it tells you about what actually happened to Nolan Wells. The second involves a claim Sharpton made that we think needs to be labeled clearly as unverified. Describing the pressure campaign against the family, Sharpton said that the parent of one of the three friends had threatened to sue him and Crump directly for, in his words, asking a question, and used an extended metaphor about hitting a pen of hogs and pigs with a brick to suggest that the family's advocacy has clearly touched a nerve with someone, evidenced by the backlash it's generated. Sharpton did not name which parent, provide documentation of the alleged lawsuit threat, or offer any way for an outside party to independently verify the claim, and no other outlet covering this same press conference appears to have followed up with a named source confirming or denying it either. We're not saying it's false. We're saying it's an unnamed, undocumented allegation made by an interested advocate in the middle of a rhetorically charged metaphor, and it should be treated with exactly the level of caution that description implies until something more specific surfaces. We think it's worth pausing on why this particular kind of unnamed claim is so hard to responsibly cover, one way or the other, because it's a recurring pattern across nearly every episode we've made on this case. If we simply repeated Sharpton's claim as fact, we'd be doing exactly what we've criticized other channels for doing with the unnamed 6 o'clock witnesses, or the unnamed independent audio engineer, or any of the other anonymous sources that have accumulated around this story. If we dismissed it outright as fabricated, we'd be making an equally unsupported claim in the opposite direction, since we have no actual evidence it isn't true either. The only honest option, in a case that's absolutely accumulated with unnamed claims from every direction, is to say clearly what we've just said. Someone made this specific allegation on the record without naming who it concerns, and we can't verify it independently, so we're not going to treat it as settled either way, no matter how much the surrounding rhetoric might invite us to. Sharpton also made a broader claim about how this case fits into a national pattern, and we think it's worth presenting his exact framing rather than a paraphrase, because the distinction he draws matters. Asked directly whether this case being described as race politics was a fair characterization, Sharpton responded that the racial politics of this case has been the reaction to it, not a predetermined conclusion about the case itself. In his words, "We're not predetermining that the case was racial. We've been determining that the investigation has been racially divided, and that's what made it racial." That's a more careful distinction than it might first appear, and one worth sitting with rather than dismissing outright or accepting uncritically. Sharpton is explicitly not claiming, in this specific answer, that race caused whatever happened to Nolan on Horn Island. He's claiming that the public reaction to the investigation, and specifically the speed and confidence with which no foul play was initially stated before a full investigation had occurred, split along racial lines in a way that itself became a story, separate from the underlying facts of Nolan's death, a distinction he was careful to draw even under fairly pointed questioning from the reporter who raised it. Whether you find that framing persuasive is a matter of judgment, this channel isn't going to settle for you. We think it deserves to be heard in its own precise words, rather than flattened into either "they're calling it racist" or "they admit it's not about race," because neither of those simpler versions actually captures what he said. It's worth engaging honestly with both directions this framing could be evaluated, rather than settling into either an automatic agreement or automatic dismissal. Sharpton's underlying factual premise, that the early no foul play suspected statement was issued before a completed investigation, is accurate and documented. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn's initial comment came within days of the body being recovered, well before the independent autopsy, well before any forensic audio analysis, well before witnesses had been fully interviewed. Whether the speed of that initial statement reflects a racially disparate pattern specific to this case, a generally hasty communications habit local officials apply regardless of race, or simply an unfortunately worded early comment that got more scrutiny than officials anticipated because the case went viral, is a genuinely contested question that this transcript alone doesn't resolve. Sharpton's framing asks you to consider the first explanation seriously. It doesn't, on its own, rule out the other two. We also want to note, briefly, a moment where a reporter pushed back directly and Crump and the family's team responded without deflecting. Asked whether the family would accept the truth if the eventual full investigation determined Nolan's death was a freak accident with nothing sinister behind it, Crump answered plainly that they would, and pointed to the family's own prior conduct in other high-profile cases as evidence of that consistency. He specifically cited the family's acceptance of the not guilty verdict in the Trayvon Martin case and the Justice Department's decision under the Obama administration not to pursue federal charges in the Michael Brown case as examples of the family's broader legal circle accepting outcomes they personally disagreed with once a fair process had actually run its course, examples he offered specifically to push back on the suggestion that this family, or his own advocacy, only accepts outcomes that confirm what they already believe. "We accept things when they're fair," he said. "We want them to be fair." That's a meaningfully different posture than simply demanding a predetermined outcome, and we think it deserves to be represented accurately alongside the more forceful, advocacy-driven language elsewhere in the same press conference. There's a related exchange later in the same session worth mentioning because it addresses a piece of speculation this channel has touched on before without being able to resolve it: whether the family intends to file a civil lawsuit against anyone connected to the case. A reporter from the Associated Press asked directly about the possibility of future litigation. Crump's answer was unusually direct for a plaintiff's attorney fielding that specific question. He said the preservation letters the family's legal team sent out, standard legal documents instructing recipients not to destroy or alter potential evidence, had been widely misinterpreted online as an announcement of an impending lawsuit, when in fact they contain the standard boilerplate language stating that litigation is reasonably anticipated, a phrase attorneys include specifically to trigger evidence preservation obligations, not to signal that a suit has actually been filed or decided upon. Crump said plainly that when Christine and Elmore first called him, they weren't thinking about a lawsuit at all. They were thinking about finding their son. He described any future legal action as, in his words, a vehicle we can use to get to the truth if the facts tell us that, conditioning it explicitly on what the eventually released evidence actually shows, rather than presenting it as a predetermined plan already set in motion, regardless of what investigators eventually find. We think that's a meaningfully more precise statement than the "they're about to sue everyone" framing that's circulated in some corners of this case's online coverage, and it's worth reflecting that precision back accurately, the same way we've tried to do with every other overstated claim we've walked through in this case so far. So where does all of this actually leave the case more than 6 weeks after Nolan Wells died on Horn Island? There is now a formal, documented 7-day deadline given to federal authorities, expiring around the same time as a nationwide prayer vigil marking what should have been his 19th birthday. There is an actual, agreed-upon process for jointly examining his phone, currently waiting on the district attorney's office to schedule it. There is an independent pathologist who remains available to conduct further examination whenever institutional access allows it. There is a real, documented cease-and-desist dispute connected to this case, though it involves the Edmiston family defending against unfounded accusations, not the Wells family suppressing critics, a distinction that matters and that we think has been blurred elsewhere in how this press conference has been summarized online. And there is a set of advocacy statements, some carefully hedged, some considerably more forceful, from people whose job in this moment is to apply pressure on behalf of a grieving family, which is legitimate advocacy work, but which shouldn't be mistaken for findings from the sealed investigation itself. We think that unsatisfying middle ground, Real uncertainty about which specific claims deserve trust and which don't. Honestly described rather than resolved into a cleaner story is the most respectful way to cover a press conference this dense with both genuine news and genuine advocacy. It would be easier and probably better for engagement to pick a side, either treating everything said at that podium as established fact because it came from sympathetic, well-credentialed people, or dismissing all of it as political theater because some of it clearly was advocacy. Neither shortcut does justice to a transcript that actually contains both a real, trackable federal deadline and an unnamed, unverifiable lawsuit allegation within the same hour, delivered by some of the same people. We also want to note how this episode connects to the broader project we've been building across our recent coverage of this case. We've now walked through a forensic pathologist's hedged commentary getting inflated into false certainty, a disputed audio recording getting treated as confirmed evidence of violence, a polygraph claim that turned out to be something else entirely, and now a press conference where genuine institutional developments sit right alongside unverifiable advocacy claims, all under the same roof. The through line across every one of these episodes isn't a specific theory about what happened to Nolan Wells. It's an insistence that the specific words people actually said and the specific sources those words can actually be traced back to matter more than how confidently or how often a claim gets repeated afterward. Nolan Wells's cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined. The state's autopsy findings remain sealed pending presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. No charges have been filed against anyone in connection with his death. We'll be watching to see whether the FBI responds within the window the Congressional Black Caucus has set, whether the joint phone examination finally gets scheduled, and whether August 19th brings anything beyond the grief and remembrance it was always going to bring regardless of what happens with any of the rest of it, because whatever else this case becomes in the weeks ahead, that date was never going to be an easy one for this family either way. We'll close with one more thing worth saying plainly, since it doesn't fit neatly into either the factual or advocacy categories we've tried to sort this entire press conference into. Nolan Wells is going to turn 19 on a day when his family is simultaneously grieving him publicly, pressuring the federal government on his behalf, and defending themselves against a lawsuit threat nobody can independently verify, plus a nursing board complaint that's already been dismissed, plus threats serious enough to have generated multiple separate criminal prosecutions. That is an extraordinary amount of weight for two grieving parents to carry in the same 6-week span, regardless of what the eventual, sealed investigation into their son's death turns out to show. We think that's worth remembering the next time any of us, this channel included, gets caught up in the legal and political mechanics of a case like this one, and loses sight, even briefly, of the fact that a specific family is living through all of it in real time, on a schedule none of them chose. This has been Forensic Disconnect. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered every single time.